Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. It is story time again, which is why I am wearing these glasses. Basically, what I'm going to do is to read a series of quotations. That's exciting, isn't it? But I think it's on a good topic. We have already discussed a bit about intersectional Marxism. We have not discussed Kyriarchy or Kyriarchy. I'm not even sure how it's pronounced. I always say Kyriarchy, but that might not be right. It is a way of understanding intersectionality or intersectional Marxism, which incorporates things like imperialism, colonialism, and cultural hegemony. When intersectionality rather was started by Kimberly Crenshaw, her focus was on race, class, and gender. When intersectionality was adopted by Patricia Hill Collins and brought into sociology, again, the primary focuses were race, class, and gender. So what Kyriarchy attempts to do is to take the concept of intersectional Marxism and expand it. And so, in other words, it's not just race, class, and gender anymore. It's now imperialism, colonialism, cultural hegemony, and more. And so that's basically what it is. And when I first read about it, which was, I think, maybe 2 years ago, I was very impressed by it. I really didn't know exactly what to make of it because I was already using intersectional Marxism in my social problems classes. It was the basic framework for those classes. But I had not yet heard of Kyriarchy. And in fact, because I knew so little about it, I never once mentioned Kyriarchy in any of my social problems classes because I really felt like I was not qualified enough to do so. Since that time, since I've retired, since I've been living down here, 2 miles north of Mexico in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, I've had a lot of time on my hands and I can pretty much do whatever I want. And one of the things that I've done is to familiarize myself more with Kyriarchy, or however it is pronounced. So, again, if you will excuse me, because much of this podcast will be taken up with me reading various quotations on Kyriarchy. Most of them are by Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza. And I'm sorry if I mispronounced her middle name. Now, the last name I know, I think, because my old best friend, who's now deceased, was named Vincent Fiorenza, same spelling. So I'm pretty sure I got the last name right. Schussler, I'm not entirely sure about. But regardless, she knows what her name is. So I will read just a few brief quotations, and then we can talk about it more after we have that background. But reading the quotations, I will warn you, will take, well, not a long time, but it won't be that quick. So be prepared, make sure your seatbelts are on, and be ready for a ride. Here we go. I have proposed to replace the category hierarchy with the neologism Kyriarchy, which is derived from the Greek words Kyrios, Lord, slave, master, father, husband, elite, propertied, educated man. Anarchian, which is to rule or to dominate. Okay, so in other words, domination by a lord or by a master or something like that. In classical antiquity, the rule of the emperor, lord, slave master, husband, or the elite freeborn, propertied, educated gentlemen to whom disenfranchised men and the way she spells it is WO/men, meaning women or men, or subordinated, is best characterized as Kyriarchy, a term that she coined. In antiquity, the social system of Kyriarchy was institutionalized either in empire or as a democratic political form of ruling. Kyriarchy is best theorized as a complex pyramidal system of intersecting, there's that intersecting word, multiplicative social and religious structures of superordination and subordination, meaning people who are above and people who are below, of ruling and oppression. Kyriarchal relations of domination are built on elite male property rights, as well as on the exploitation, dependency, inferiority, and obedience of women, again, that's WO/MEN, who signify all those subordinated. Such kyriarchal relations are still today at work in the multiplicative intersectionality of class, race, gender, ethnicity, empire, again, a term that is not commonly used in either intersectionality or intersectional Marxism, and other structures of discrimination. Kyriarchy is constituted as a socio-cultural and religious system of dominations by intersecting multiplicative structures of oppression. The different sets of relations of domination shift historically and produce a different constellation of oppression in different times and cultures. The structural positions of subordination that have been fashioned by kyriarchal relations stand in tension with those required by radical democracy. A critical intersectional analytic does not understand kyriarchy as an essentialist ahistorical system. Let me explain that briefly, then we'll continue. Essentialist, referring to the idea that we can best understand reality by focusing on essences. That would also include human reality or human realities. So, for example, there would be an essence of being a man, an essence of being a woman, an essence of being black, an essence of being white, and so on. Okay, so that's basically, you know, the idea behind ahistorical and what ahistorical means in that particular context. Okay, so let me start from the beginning of that paragraph. Kyriarchy is constituted as a sociocultural and religious system of dominations by intersecting multiplicative structures of oppression. The different sets of relations of domination shift historically and produce a different constellation of oppression in different times and cultures. The structural positions of subordination that have been fashioned by kyriarchal relations stand in tension with those required by radical democracy. A critical intersectional analytic does not understand Kyriarchy as an essentialist ahistorical system. Ahistorical meaning separated from history. Instead, it articulates Kyriarchy as a heuristic, which is derived from the Greek meaning to find concept, or as a diagnostic, analytic instrument that enables investigation into the multiplicative interdependence, she likes big words, doesn't she, of gender, race, class, and imperial, okay, so there's imperialism, stratifications, as well as into their discursive inscriptions and ideological reproductions. Okay, so that's the end of the first quote. That pretty much gives a broad overview into what Fiorenza is talking about in terms of Kyriarchy. Let's go on to the next quote. There are a number of benefits to employing intersectionality and Kyriarchy together as an integrated framework. The immediate benefit to integrating intersectionality and Kyriarchy is for the conceptual clarity the two offer when used together. Kyriarchy describes a multifaceted power structure and allows us to understand power as a function of multiple axes of identity and privilege, rather than focusing on one, for example, as with gender and patriarchy, or race and white supremacy, which is inadequate for understanding the complexity of lived experience. Simply put, Kyriarchy describes the power structures intersectionality creates. Let me read that again. Simply put, Kyriarchy describes the power structures intersectionality creates. Good way of putting it. In turn, Kyriarchy creates intersectional identities and lived experiences determined by multiple, sometimes conflicting, axes of identity, where patriarchy is understood as the force shaping and perpetuating gendered oppression. So she's making a distinction there between Kyriarchy and patriarchy, which comes from the root meaning, well, literally meaning father, but in this case, it refers to man or male leadership. Kyriarchy is understood as the structure shaping intersectional oppression. Ergo, for a conceptual framework to comprehensively and clearly incorporate an understanding of the multifaceted nature of privilege and marginality. Both are best employed. By both, she means intersectionality and Kyriarchy. An integrated framework also improves our capacity to examine individual experiences of marginality and vulnerability within the context of structural power. An intersectional study that draws from Kyriarchy to establish its theory of structural power can demonstrate how intersectional identities and, in turn, lived experiences are produced and experienced through Kyriarchy. A Kyriarchal study may draw from intersectionality in order to understand how the experiences of this structural power are shaped by the intersection of identity groups at the individual level. Kyriarchy does not conflate or collapse all structures of oppression into a single, undifferentiated structure. Different structures can have distinct functions that shape how they operate, and although the structures interact, share similarities and co-constitute each other, meaning they work to bring each other into existence, at times it is prudent to engage in strategic essentialism. There's that word essentialism again. Colonialism operates quite differently to heterosexism as one example. And so it can be useful to foreground a particular access when seeking to understand how it functions and is perpetuated. Okay, that quotation was by Natalie Osborne, so another writer, but she is drawing upon Fiorenza's notion of Kyriarchy and explaining it in her own terms. Let me clarify the term heterosexism. That is a term that is commonly used in academia. We use it in sociology, for example. I assume people in other academic fields use it as well, but it is not commonly used by the general public. Heterosexism is basically another term for homophobia. Heterosexism, in my view, and not only in my view, but in my view, is preferable to homophobia for a variety of reasons. One, which I think is the major one, is that homophobia assumes, or at least the term assumes, that the reason why there is bigotry against gays and lesbians is because people are afraid of them. That sounds odd to me. I've never known anybody, and I have even known some bigots. I have known some people who were very bigoted against gays and lesbians. Unfortunately, most of them were my students. But were they afraid of gays and lesbians? I don't think so. Really wouldn't make much sense. So heterosexism clarifies it, meaning a system dominated by heterosexuals, but it does not put it into the context of being a phobia, which is what homophobia does, right? I mean, there's no fear of homosexuals. That's kind of a silly idea. Okay, so anyway, that's the idea behind that. Now, just as a clarification, that is not to say that the term phobia cannot be used in other sociological contexts. For example, I think that Islamophobia is a perfectly logical term. Why? Well, because there are a lot of people, I think, and I've met some, sadly, who are literally afraid of Muslims and afraid of Islam. I remember hearing all these people talk about, oh, they're going to impose Sharia law. And often I would say, well, okay, what's Sharia law? Not one person I ever asked could answer that question. They had this idea in their heads that somehow these Muslims or Islam itself, if given the chance, would impose Sharia law, but they themselves did not even know what Sharia law was. That's often how bigotry operates, unfortunately. So in that sense, using the term Islamophobia, I think would make sense because there really are people who sadly are afraid of Muslims and of the religion of Islam. Okay, next quotation. This is by Nathan Dawthorne. Nathan Dawthorne. Kimberly Crenshaw and bell hooks, among other feminists of color, have helped shape the social sciences by calling out how a singular and exclusive focus on the oppression of women replicates colonial discourses that silence marginal and dissenting voices. The concept of intersectionality helped illustrate how Black women do not have the same experiences as white women, nor Black men, both groups who had established activist organizations. As a person occupies many social locations, social positions, in other words, the intersection of these culminates into an experience greater than the sum of its parts, which is usually how it is, right? I mean, most of our experiences are much more complex than the individual parts that constitute it. These standpoints make politics based on one identity inadequate, as they ignore other forms of oppression. Some of these axes include race, ethnicity, religion, class, sexuality, gender identity, expression, conformity, relationship, ability, body type, size, and age. Expanding on this is Patricia Hill Collins' Matrix of Domination, which looks at the overall structure of power in society and attempts to move beyond black and white thinking. And that's literal. Black meaning African American, white meaning European American. Accounting for shades of gray, nuance, context, and the non-hierarchical. To help address issues of dominance and subordination between women, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza developed the idea of Kyriarchy to move away from patriarchy as an analytical tool to recognize complex systems of oppression and privilege that shape experiences. Again, that's by Nathan Dawthorne. Very good quotation, kind of sums up, I think, what we've read previously. Now, just one more quotation to go. That's it. Just one more quotation. In her concept of the Kyriarchy, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza has helpfully coined a word for the interacting, interlocking systems of domination and subordination that inform the modern world. As a pyramidal system, the Kyriarchy includes not only sexism, racism, and heteronormativity. I'll explain that in a moment. But also, among other things, militarism and anthropocentrism. I will also explain that in a moment. The vaunted human has endangered the climate and sparked an ecological crisis that threatens the very existence of the human species, the animal kingdom, plant life, water, and air. The trouble of the human is, therefore, not only an internal human family matter, but also an external ecological crisis, which has disturbed and provoked nature, making the world a dangerous place for the human and for other life forms. That was co-authored, and again, I'm sorry if I'm probably going to mispronounce his name, William MPOFU. I'm going to guess Pofu, but that might be wrong, and Melissa Stein. So those are a few quotations which summarize it. I said I would go back and explain those two words because they're not commonly used. The first is heteronormativity. The hetero is taken from heterosexual, and it means heterosexual in this context. Normativity means what is considered as being normative. In sociology, for example, we generally don't use the word normal, or we try not to use it, because normal has psychological or even psychiatric connotations. So we say normative, which means basically that which conforms to social norms. That's normative. So basically, it's saying that the norm is established by heterosexuals. And I think that that's obviously true. Certainly that's true in most Western countries. The next term that I said I would explain is anthropocentrism. That term, the prefix anthro means man, literally means man. And the term, basically what the term means is a view of the world centered around human beings. So an anthropocentrist will be someone who says, well, the most important creatures in the world are us. Us. Who cares about animals or other animals, I should say, and plants and, well, rocks, I guess, don't really count, but certainly plants and other animals. It is looking at the world from a human-centered perspective. And that is something which I think most people do. We elevate ourselves above other categories of existence. We place ourselves on a higher plane. And so we consider primarily that which benefits or hurts us, and not that which benefits or hurts animals or plants, especially animals. You know, I love birds. I really love birds. Ever since I moved down here to the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, there are so many wonderful birds here, these tropical birds, and many of them have no experience with human beings, and so they're so friendly. They'll come right up to you. They're so nice. Anyway, but so birds, I love birds, and of course I love dogs and cats as well, and most animals. I guess there's some I don't like. I would have to think about it for a second. Maybe a wild tiger I might not care much for. Especially, well, maybe in a zoo that would be okay, but if I were actually face to face with one, I don't think I would be very happy about that. But in any event, for the most part, what these authors are saying is that we have a tendency as humans to elevate ourselves among, or above, I should say, other categories of existence. Animals, other animals, and plants. And that's not good. That's not good because we all need each other. We certainly need plants. We need plants. We eat plants. We need animals. Arguably, we eat animals. I know some people don't like that. Unfortunately, I have to admit, I eat animals. Sorry. You know, maybe I shouldn't, but I do. I have tried being a vegetarian, even a vegan, at various times with no success at all. And so I've simply abandoned the idea. I just like meat too much. Some people can't eat meat without thinking of the animal they are eating. I can. So I guess that's why I can do it. Anyway, let's get back to the topic. That's really a diversion from the topic. Essentially, then, what Kyriarchy is, to recap, which I think was explained in these various quotations. It's based on intersectionality, and in a sense, it can be considered as a type of intersectionality, or a version of intersectionality, but it is a type of intersectionality which goes beyond race, class, and gender. And here's the problem, as I see it, with focusing on race, class, and gender. Just saying those words indicates that the person is not likely a Marxist. Why? Well, because class is capitalism. And certainly race and gender can be seen as oppressions caused by capitalism or class, but to put class on the same level as race and gender is, I think, misleading. And as a Marxist, I would say wrong. Capitalism or class, whatever you want to call it, to be more specific, socioeconomic status, a fancy term that we use for class in sociology when we want to explain precisely what we mean by it, like what kinds of occupational, what kinds of educational, what kinds of income indices are we going to use? So that's a more precise way of discussing class. But either way, class is capitalism. You can't have capitalism without class. And you can't have class without capitalism. Once class is gone, capitalism will be gone as well. So I think that just that term, race, class, and gender, which was kind of a defining ingredient, or maybe a defining proposal for intersectionality as it was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw and later Patricia Hill Collins, shows that they are not exactly using a Marxist framework. If you use a Marxist framework, you can't do that. You've got to recognize that class is the foundation, capitalism is the foundation. Then you can look at other types of oppression which exist either within the context of class or perhaps which are caused by class oppression, or in other words, capitalism. So, again, going back to the contributing factor that Kyriarchy makes to intersectionality, it is imperialism, it is colonialism, and it is cultural hegemony. Let me explain those briefly, although I assume you probably know what they are, but let me explain them briefly. Let me also take down the screen since I'm already finished with that. I don't need that screen up anymore. Imperialism, from the same root as the word empire. That is why I very commonly, and not just me, use the term the empire, with no reference to Star Wars, to refer to the American empire, the empire which is dominated by the United States. That's the empire. And so the world is unfortunately under the sway of the empire. There's no way to get around it. The United States has tremendous amounts of power in the world. Do I wish it did not? Absolutely. But I'm a realist, not an idealist. Whatever I wish is inconsequential. I need to look at existing material conditions, as Karl Marx said, and deal with those real existing material conditions, and then explore ways in which perhaps we may move beyond those conditions to a world in which there is no more imperialism, in which there is no more empire, in other words, in which one nation, or one nation with a number of other nations subordinated to it, dominates much of the rest of the world, or perhaps even the entire world. And I think that is largely true with the empire, or the American empire. The empire has enormous amounts of power, much too much power. It's no one nation or no one group of nations, like NATO, for example, which may be a way of talking about the empire as well, should have the amount of power that it does. And yet we have to deal with the reality, not the fantasy. The reality is that NATO exists, the United States exists, and they have tremendous amounts of power as well as influence. And wishing it away is not going to change it. We need to actually figure out ways for how we can overturn the capitalist system. And ultimately, I think that can only be done, at least initially, by the third world, because the first world simply does not have enough dialectical or revolutionary potential now. Maybe in the future it will, but certainly not now. So we need to figure out ways in which we can encourage the third world, perhaps through conscientization, to again use that word, to be the leader and to basically give up our own leadership. By our own, I mean the first world. Say, okay, we give up. We will no longer be in charge. We have failed, and we have failed miserably. So empire needs to literally be torn apart. Imperialism needs to be torn apart. Okay. Colonialism. That's a pretty obvious term, but I'll explain it anyway, referring obviously to colonies. And, you know, of course, the United States at one time was, or much of the United States was a collection of colonies. There was a war for independence that was fought. I would not call it a revolutionary war. I'm sorry, I would not. To me, the so-called American Revolution was really more of a coup d'etat, meaning it changed who was in control, but it didn't fundamentally change the structure of power. Yeah, it meant that New York, New Jersey, etc., were no longer British colonies. Fine. How did that change anything? Look at Canada. Canada, which did not want to take part in the American Revolution. There was a war that the US fought against Canada, trying to get Canada to join the US and fight for independence from Britain. And Canada kicked the US out. Now, here we are in the 21st century. How much difference does that really make? Because it wasn't a revolution. There was no genuine revolution, or at least as I would define revolution in the US. We need a revolution, but that revolution needs to be a communist revolution. What we saw with the so-called American Revolution, or actually American coup d'etat, was actually simply a changing of hands from one hand to another. That's really all we saw. So now we have a lot of places that are still colonies. Many colonies have been given their independence, but they're still poor. There are still some countries that are still colonies. Many people think, for example, that Puerto Rico is a colony of the US. Technically, it is not. Technically, it is, I think the term is dependency, if I have that right. But technically, it is not a colony. Does that really matter? I don't know. I don't know. The last time that Puerto Ricans had a chance to vote as to whether they wanted to have one of three statuses: to remain as they are, which is basically an American dependency, to become independent, or basically to become the 51st state. They voted to become the 51st state. What has happened? Nothing. Nothing. And I think it is doubtful, at least for the time being, that anything will happen. And the answer is political, as it almost always is. The Republicans don't want more Democrats, and they are afraid that if Puerto Rico becomes the 51st state, that it will become a predominantly Democratic state. And they may be right. So as a result, even though Puerto Rico has said that it would like to become the 51st state, heaven knows why, but whatever, they are not getting that wish. They are not getting that wish. So it's hard to say. And then you look at a place like Hawaii, which we've talked about already. We talked about Hulani K. Trask, who just recently died, a great hero in the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, who does not recognize the colonization of Hawaii by the United States and considers Hawaii to be an independent country. So there are a lot of places that still are colonies. There are places that were colonies, but still don't have that much power. There are places that were colonies, that were colonized, I should say, and really maybe they would like to change their status, but they have literally not been given that opportunity. So colonialism is a very unfortunate issue. I had personally hoped, when I was much younger, that by the time we got to this time, basically a quarter of the way into the 21st century, right? That's where we are, a quarter of the way into the 21st century, that we would have resolved this problem of colonialism. And we have not. It is still very much with us. Okay, finally, cultural hegemony, a term coined by the Italian Marxist, Leninist, and communist Antonio Gramsci, an absolutely brilliant man, imprisoned by Mussolini. And I think that they both took pleasure in it for different reasons. Mussolini took pleasure in the fact that he was being imprisoned by Mussolini, and Mussolini took pleasure in the fact that he was imprisoning Gramsci. So they both enjoyed it, but obviously not for the same reason. What Gramsci said is that the reason why we still are living in a world dominated by the capitalist world system, to use Immanuel Wallerstein's term, is because the governments of the world control the media. They control the information that we get. And they have made sure that all the information that we get is in favor of themselves. So they have simply not allowed hegemony to be challenged. And so the hegemony of certain countries, like the United States globally, continues to exist. And when I think about, can that be changed? I would say, in the context of the first world or the empire, the answer is clearly no. It's not going to change. Why? Because the United States has no interest in seeing it change. In fact, it would literally be contrary to their interests. So that's not in the interests of the US. Hegemony is desirable if you have it, and it's undesirable if you don't. And unfortunately, there are way too many countries that have it. I would say especially the US, but certainly not only the US. The US and all the countries that make up the empire that are using that hegemony, are using that control over knowledge to maintain the status quo. Think about the way that Israel has been using its control, not only of the Israeli media, but of the Western media, to put out a favorable view of its war in Gaza. Why? In other words, why is there not more outrage? More public outrage? I mean, there is outrage, but not as much as you would think, or I would think. It's because of cultural hegemony. Israel is using its influence over the media to basically stigmatize anybody who would dare to challenge it as being anti-Semitic, unfortunately. And that's really a shame. Speaking as somebody from a Jewish background, speaking as somebody who understands what anti-Semitism is. Although I can't say I've experienced it much, but I've experienced it a bit. And I've never in my life equated anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. I think that is a relatively new idea, but it's one that is extremely convenient for the Israeli government right now. And it's a way that they are holding on to power. It's a way that they are going into Gaza and literally demolishing it. Why? Because they want it. They want the land, they want the sea, they want Gaza. And they don't seem to care who they kill in the process. So that's another example of cultural hegemony, and it's one that we're seeing right now, assuming that you are watching this podcast at approximately the same time as the war in Gaza is going on. Who knows what will happen after the war in Gaza is over, or if we will still be around after the war in Gaza is over. I hope so. Or at least I hope that the third world will be around. Well, that's about all I have to say. So for now, this is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.